The storm had been raging for 3 days straight, and Lyra knew it wasn't natural. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the abandoned watchtower, her clothes soaked through and clinging to her trembling frame. The lightning that split the sky above wasn't the ordinary kind. It pulsed with an otherworldly purple hue, and each time it struck, she felt an answering pull deep in her chest, like a string being tugged by invisible hands. "Not again," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. The last time a storm like this had hit Valenhart, she'd been found unconscious in a field of scorched earth, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The villagers had whispered about her then, crossing themselves and avoiding her gaze. Storm-touched, they called her. Cursed. The wind howled through the broken windows of the watchtower, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something else, something wild and dangerous. Lyra's enhanced omega senses, already heightened by her distress, picked up the subtle shift in the air pressure. Someone was coming. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. The storm's energy was building inside her like a dam about to burst, and she could see tiny sparks dancing between her fingers. This was why she'd fled to the borderlands, away from the pack territories where her presence could endanger innocent people. Here in the no-man's land between the Shadow Pack's domain and the neutral zones, she could suffer through these episodes alone. Another flash of lightning illuminated the landscape outside, and in that brief moment, she saw him. A figure moving through the rain with purposeful strides, seemingly unbothered by the supernatural storm. Even from a distance, she could tell he was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of raw power. But it was his scent that made her blood run cold. Alpha. Not just any alpha, but one whose presence felt like a physical weight pressing down on her already overwhelmed senses. Lyra scrambled to her feet, ignoring the way her vision blurred and her hands sparked with uncontrolled energy. She needed to run, to get as far away as possible before he caught her scent. Alphas and Stormborn Omegas were a dangerous combination. Her power could amplify their already formidable abilities, but the process could kill her in the process. She made it exactly 3 steps before her legs buckled, and she collapsed to the stone floor, consciousness slipping away as the storm's energy finally overwhelmed her defenses. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a pair of silver eyes watching her from the watchtower's entrance, and the last thing she felt was the impossible warmth of strong arms lifting her from the cold stone. When those silver eyes looked down at her unconscious form, they held an expression that would have surprised anyone who knew the Shadow Alpha's reputation, not calculation or conquest, but something that looked remarkably like concern. Zerstifaki Seder Kale Nightcrest had ruled the Shadow Pack for 8 years, and in all that time, he had never once questioned his instincts. They had kept him alive through countless challenges, helped him expand his territory, and earned him a reputation as the most ruthless alpha in the northern territories of Valenhart. So why was he currently carrying an unconscious Omega through a supernatural storm, instead of leaving her where he'd found her? The logical part of his mind, the part that had been honed by years of leadership and warfare, whispered that she was dangerous. Stormborn Omegas were the stuff of legends, and legends in Valenhart usually ended in bloodshed. The smart thing would be to put her down quickly and quietly before she could become a threat to his pack. But as he looked down at her face, peaceful in unconsciousness despite the purple lightning that continued to dance beneath her skin, he found himself unable to even consider that option. She was beautiful in an ethereal way that had nothing to do with conventional attractiveness. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, a mark of her connection to the storm magic, and her skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But it was her scent that truly captivated him. Beneath the ozone and electricity, she smelled like rain on summer grass, and something indefinably sweet that made his wolf pace restlessly in his mind. Kale kicked open the door to his private cabin, a hunting lodge he kept on the outskirts of his territory for times when he needed solitude. The storm seemed to follow them inside, with shadows dancing strangely on the walls and the fire in the hearth flickering in patterns that defied the laws of physics. He laid her carefully on the leather couch near the fireplace, noting how the flames seemed to lean toward her, as if drawn by some invisible force. Her clothes were not just wet, but actually steaming, and when he checked her pulse, her skin was almost feverishly hot. "What are you?" he murmured, brushing a strand of that silver-streaked hair away from her face. As if in response to his touch, her eyes snapped open. Not the brown or blue he might have expected, but a striking violet that seemed to hold flecks of actual lightning. For a moment they stared at each other in complete silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. Then reality crashed back into her consciousness, and she jerked upright so quickly that sparks literally flew from her fingertips. "Don't!" she gasped, pressing herself back against the arm of the couch. "You need to stay away from me. The storm, when it's like this, I can't control it. I could hurt you." Kyle almost laughed at that. Very few things in Valenhart could hurt him, and certainly no Omega, Stormborn or otherwise. But something in her voice, a mixture of genuine fear and desperate concern for his safety, made him take a step back instead. "You're safe," he said simply. "The storm is passing." She looked toward the window, and indeed the supernatural purple lightning was beginning to fade back to ordinary white and gold. As it did, the sparks dancing around her fingers grew dimmer, though they didn't disappear entirely. "You're him," she said suddenly, her violet eyes widening with recognition. "The Shadow Alpha, Kyle Nightcrest." Her voice carried a mixture of awe and terror that he was unfortunately accustomed to hearing. "I am." He moved slowly to the chair across from her, deliberately keeping his distance. "And you are a Stormborn Omega with no pack markings and no scent markers indicating a mate or family." It was a statement, not a question. "That makes you either an exile or a rogue." She flinched at the words. "I'm not rogue. I don't belong anywhere. People get hurt when I'm around during the storms." "What's your name?" She hesitated for a long moment, as if even that simple information was too dangerous to share. Finally, she whispered, "Lyra." "Well, Lyra," Kyle said, leaning forward slightly, "you have two choices. You can tell me your story, or you can face whatever's out there in the darkness alone." He gestured toward the window, where the natural storm was still raging, even though the magical elements had subsided. "Because something tells me this wasn't just a random weather event, and you know more about it than you're letting on." Lyra's violet eyes darted around the cabin, taking in every detail, the way the shadows seemed to move independently of the firelight, the silver weapons mounted on the walls, the books bound in what looked suspiciously like dragon hide. This wasn't just any hunting lodge. This was a place where dangerous business was conducted. "You want my story?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most people prefer the rumors. They're much more interesting than the truth." Kyle remained perfectly still, but she could sense the predatory focus behind his silver eyes. It wasn't the kind of attention that made her want to run. Surprisingly, it made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "I'm not most people," he said simply. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the ordinary rain continued to fall, but inside the cabin the air hummed with a different kind of tension. "I was born during the great storm of Valenhart," Lyra began, her fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the leather couch. 23 years ago, when the magical barriers between realms were at their weakest. My parents, they tried to love me, but every time I got emotional as a child, things would catch fire or shatter. By the time I was 12, they sent me to the temple of the moon goddess, hoping the priestesses could help me control it. And did they? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. They tried. For 6 years, they tried everything. Meditation, binding rituals, even attempting to sever my connection to the storm magic entirely. Nothing worked. If anything, trying to suppress it made the episodes worse. Kyle leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What changed?" "The night I turned 18, another great storm hit. The priestesses were so afraid of what might happen that they chained me in the temple's lowest chambers, thinking the blessed silver would contain my power." Her voice grew quieter, and tiny sparks began dancing around her fingertips again. It didn't contain it. It redirected it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kyle's wolf was suddenly alert, sensing the shift in her emotional state. "The entire temple complex was destroyed," she continued, her violet eyes now fixed on the fire. 17 priestesses died that night. The only reason I survived was because the storm magic burned through the silver chains, and I managed to escape before the building collapsed completely. "That was 5 years ago," Kyle said, his voice carrying no judgment, only calculation. "What have you been doing since then?" "Running, hiding, trying to stay away from populated areas when I feel a storm building." She finally met his gaze again. "The episodes are getting stronger, and they're happening more frequently. I think something is changing in the magical balance of Valenhart, and I'm connected to it somehow." Before Cale could respond, a sharp howl pierced the night air. Not the call of a natural wolf, but the communication cry of one of his pack members. The sound carried urgency, and a warning that made every muscle in his body tense. He was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a predator. What he saw in the distance made his blood run cold. "We have company," he said grimly. Chapter 4. The Hunt Begins. Lyra joined him at the window, and her breath caught in her throat. Through the rain, she could see at least a dozen figures moving through the forest with unnatural coordination. They carried weapons that gleamed with an oily, dark sheen that she instinctively knew was poison. Specifically, poison designed to kill supernatural creatures. "Hunters," she whispered, the word carrying all the fear and hatred she'd learned to associate with that particular breed of human fanatic. "Not just any hunters," Kyle growled, his voice deepening as his wolf rose closer to the surface. "The Order of the Silver Dawn. They've been tracking storm-born creatures for decades, believing that your kind are abominations that need to be cleansed from the world." Lyra's hands began to shake, and with her emotional distress came the inevitable response. Electricity began arcing between her fingers, growing stronger with each passing second. "This is my fault," she said, backing away from the window. "They followed my trail from the storm. If I hadn't lost control earlier—" "Stop!" Kyle's command was sharp enough to cut through her rising panic. "Self-blame is a luxury we don't have right now. How well can you control your abilities when you're calm?" I can manage small things. Light fires, charge simple devices, create barriers if I have enough time to focus." She looked down at her hands, where the sparks were growing brighter. "But when I'm scared or angry, everything becomes unpredictable." Another howl echoed through the night, this one much closer. Kyle moved to the weapons wall, selecting a wickedly curved blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Then we need to keep you calm," he said, testing the blade's balance with practiced ease. "And we need to get you out of here before they surround the cabin completely." "Why are you helping me?" Lyra asked suddenly. "You don't know me. For all you know, I really am the dangerous abomination they claim I am." Kyle paused in his preparations, turning to look at her with those penetrating silver eyes. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask of cold efficiency slipped, and she caught a glimpse of something raw and honest underneath. "Because I've spent my entire life being called a monster," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to have people fear you for something you can't control. And because—" He hesitated, as if the next words were being dragged from some deep, protected place. "Because my wolf recognized something in you the moment I caught your scent. Something that feels like—" The front door of the cabin exploded inward in a shower of splinters and silver dust. 3 hunters burst through the opening, crossbows already loaded and aimed, but their target wasn't Lyra. It was Kyle. The Silver Dawn had clearly done their research and knew exactly who they were dealing with. "Shadow Alpha," the lead hunter called out, his voice distorted by the metallic mask covering his face. "Step away from the abomination, and we might let you live." Kyle's response was a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from someplace primal and utterly without mercy. "You made your first mistake when you broke down my door," he said, his form already beginning to shift as his wolf fought for dominance. "Your second mistake was threatening what's mine." The word mine sent an unexpected thrill through Lyra, but she didn't have time to analyze the feeling because chaos erupted in the small cabin. Kale moved faster than human reflexes should have allowed, his blade finding the throat of the first hunter before the man could fire his crossbow. The second hunter got off a shot, but the silver-tipped bolt passed harmlessly through the space where Kale had been standing a split second before. The third hunter, however, had shifted his aim to Lyra. Time seemed to slow as she watched the bolt fly toward her chest, its silver tip gleaming with deadly promise. But instead of fear, something else rose within her, something fierce and protective and utterly furious, that these people had dared to threaten the Alpha who had shown her kindness. Lightning erupted from her hands in a focused stream, meeting the crossbow bolt mid-air and vaporizing it instantly. The electrical discharge continued past the destroyed projectile, striking the hunter square in the chest and sending him flying backward through the broken doorway. When the light faded, Lyra was standing in the center of the cabin with electricity still dancing around her entire body, her violet eyes blazing with power that was no longer out of control. For the first time in her life, Her abilities had responded not to panic or desperation, but to the fierce desire to protect someone she was beginning to care about. Kyle, who had just finished dispatching the second hunter, turned to stare at her with something that looked remarkably like awe. Chapter 5. The Bond Awakens. The silence that followed the lightning strike was deafening. Lyra stood frozen in the center of the destroyed cabin, electricity still crackling softly around her fingers as she stared at what she had done. The hunter she'd struck lay motionless in the mud outside the broken doorway, his silver armor blackened and smoking. "I killed him," she whispered, her voice hollow with shock. "No," Kyle said, moving to check the fallen hunter's pulse. "Unconscious, but alive. Your lightning was precise, enough to incapacitate, not enough to kill." He looked up at her with something that might have been pride. "You controlled it perfectly." Before Lyra could process that revelation, the sound of approaching footsteps and voices carried through the rain. More hunters were coming, drawn by the commotion and the flash of her lightning. "We need to move," Kyle said, grabbing a pack from beside the fireplace. "Now!" But as Lyra tried to take a step forward, her legs buckled beneath her. The controlled use of her power had drained her more than any wild episode ever had. Kyle caught her before she hit the floor, and the moment his hands touched her bare arms, something extraordinary happened. A surge of warm energy flowed between them, not the chaotic electricity of her storm magic, but something deeper and more fundamental. Lyra gasped as she felt strength returning to her limbs, while Kyle stiffened as if he'd been struck by lightning himself. "What was that?" she breathed, looking up into his silver eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, but his voice was rougher than before, and when he helped her to her feet, he didn't immediately let go of her hand. "But we'll figure it out later. Right now, we run." They slipped out through the cabin's back window just as the main group of hunters reached the front entrance. Kale led her through the forest with sure steps, his enhanced night vision guiding them along paths that were invisible to human eyes. Behind them, angry shouts and the barking of tracking hounds indicated that their escape had been discovered. "Where are we going?" Lyra asked as they half ran, half stumbled through the undergrowth. "There's an old sanctuary about 2 miles from here," Kyle replied, helping her over a fallen log. "It was built during the First War between the supernatural realms and the human kingdoms. If the old protections still hold, it should shield us from both physical pursuit and magical tracking." As if summoned by his words, a crossbow bolt whistled past Lyra's ear, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. The hunters were gaining ground, their human stamina supplemented by enhancement potions that allowed them to match supernatural speed for short periods. "They're too close," Kyle growled, his wolf fighting to emerge fully. "I should have killed them all back at the cabin." "You saved the one I struck," Lyra pointed out, breathing hard as they continued to run. "Why?" "Because you chose mercy over vengeance," he said simply. "And because unnecessary killing changes you piece by piece, until you become the monster everyone already thinks you are." Another bolt flew past them, this one close enough to tear through the sleeve of Lyra's shirt. The hunters were definitely gaining ground, and worse, she could hear the mechanical whir of something that sounded distinctly like a drone overhead. "Kyle," she said, slowing slightly, "they have aerial support. They'll track us no matter how well we hide our trail." He cursed in what sounded like an ancient werewolf dialect, then pulled her behind a massive oak tree. "Can you bring down their drone without alerting every supernatural creature within 50 miles? Lyra closed her eyes, reaching out with senses she was still learning to trust. She could feel the electrical systems of the mechanical device hovering above them, its cameras, its communication array, its GPS tracking system. "I think so," she said, "but I'll need you to keep me grounded." "What does that mean?" Instead of explaining, she took his hand in both of hers. The moment their skin made contact again, that strange warm energy began flowing between them. But this time, instead of feeling drained by her power, Lyra felt supported by something strong and steady and utterly reliable. She reached out with her lightning, not in a wild discharge, but in precise tendrils that sought out the drone's electronics. One by one, she shorted out its systems, cameras first, then communications, then navigation. The mechanical whir above them faltered and died, followed by the distant crash of metal hitting trees. When she opened her eyes, she found Kyle staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was incredible," he said softly. "I could feel what you were doing through our connection. It was like being part of a lightning storm, but safe inside it." Before Lyra could respond, The sound of hunting horns echoed through the forest. The drone crash had given away their general location, and the silver dawn was closing in. They ran. Chapter 6. Sanctuary and Revelations. The sanctuary, when they finally reached it, was not what Lyra had expected. Instead of a grand temple or imposing fortress, it was a simple stone circle set in a clearing, with runes carved into each standing stone that glowed with a soft, welcoming light. "It doesn't look like much," Kyle admitted as they stumbled into the circle's center, both breathing hard from their desperate flight. But appearances can be deceiving. The moment they crossed the threshold marked by the stones, Lyra felt it, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a sense of safety settling over her like a warm blanket. The constant low-level anxiety she'd been carrying for 5 years seemed to ease for the first time since the temple's destruction. "The protections are still active," she said wonderingly, looking around at the glowing runes. "I can feel them. They're designed to hide us from both physical and magical detection." "More than that," Kyle said, settling down on the grass, with a relief that suggested his injuries from the fight were more serious than he'd let on. "This place was built as a neutral ground. No violence can be done here by anyone with supernatural blood. The hunters can't enter, and even if they could, their weapons wouldn't function." Lyra knelt beside him, noticing for the first time that his shirt was torn and bloody where one of the silver-tipped bolts had grazed his ribs. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said automatically, but when she reached toward the wound, he didn't pull away. The moment her fingers touched his skin, that strange energy flowed between them again, but this time Lyra could feel it doing something more than just sharing strength. The torn flesh was actually healing, the silver burns fading as her lightning magic somehow neutralized the toxic effects of the blessed metal. "How is this possible?" she whispered, watching the wound close beneath her touch. "I have a theory," Kyle said, his voice careful and measured, "but you're not going to like it." "Tell me." He was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes studying her face as if memorizing every detail. When he finally spoke, his words were soft, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I think we're mates, Lyra. True mates, bonded by something deeper than pack lore or even werewolf instinct." He paused, watching for her reaction. "The energy transfer, the way your power stabilizes when I'm touching you, the way my wolf recognized you instantly. These aren't coincidences." Lyra's first instinct was to deny it. True mates were the stuff of fairy tales, rare even among werewolves and practically unheard of between an alpha and a storm-born omega. But as she looked down at her hands, still glowing faintly with the residual energy of healing his wound, she couldn't argue with the evidence. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "I'm not even a proper werewolf. The storm magic corrupted whatever wolf blood I might have inherited. I can't shift, I can't run with a pack, I can't—" "You can do something no other wolf can do," Kyle interrupted gently. "You can channel the raw power of creation itself, and somehow, impossibly, that power responds to mine." He reached up to cup her face with one hand, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before she could answer, a new voice spoke from the edge of the stone circle, ancient, female, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What you're going to do, young Alpha, is listen very carefully to what I have to tell you, because the bond you've just discovered isn't a happy accident. It's the first sign that the prophecy of the Storm Crown is beginning to unfold." They turned to see an elderly woman standing just outside the circle's boundary. She was small and bent with age, but her eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated wisdom. Most remarkably, she seemed completely unafraid of either the powerful Alpha or the Stormborn Omega who could have killed her with a thought. "Who are you?" Kyle demanded, his protective instincts immediately flaring. The old woman smiled, and in that expression Lyra caught a glimpse of something both terrible and wonderful. "I am Seraphina, last of the Oracle Witches of Valenheart," she said simply, "and I have been waiting a very long time to meet the two of you." Chapter 7. The Prophecy Unveiled. Seraphina stepped into the stone circle with the fluid grace of someone far younger than her appearance suggested. As she crossed the threshold, the runes on the standing stones flared brighter, responding to her presence with what felt like recognition rather than alarm. "Oracle Witch," Kyle said, his voice carrying both respect and wariness. "I thought your kind were extinct." "Not extinct," Seraphina corrected, settling herself on the grass across from them with surprising ease. Hidden. We've been waiting for the signs to align, for the prophecy to begin its final movement. Her ancient eyes fixed on Lyra. And you, Stormchild, are the key to everything. Lyra instinctively moved closer to Cale, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I don't understand. What prophecy? What does any of this have to do with me? Seraphina smiled, but it was a sad expression, weighted with knowledge of future sorrows. Long ago, when the first Stormborn were created by the collision of magical realms, the Oracle Witches foresaw a time when the balance between worlds would be threatened, when ancient evils, sealed away for centuries, would begin to stir again. She gestured to the runes around them, which began to shift and change, forming new patterns that told a story in flowing, luminous script. The prophecy speaks of a Stormborn Omega, who would arise in the darkest hour, bonded to an Alpha whose power runs as deep as shadow itself. Together, they would either save the realm from falling into eternal darkness, or their failure would herald the end of all supernatural life in Valenheart. That's quite a burden to place on two people who just met, Cale said dryly, but Lyra could feel the tension in his body as he processed the Oracle's words. You didn't just meet, Seraphina said sharply. Your souls have been calling to each other across the realms for lifetimes. The mate bond you've discovered is not chance. It's destiny preparing its final gambit. Lyra shook her head, overwhelmed. You're talking about souls and destiny and ancient evils, but I can barely control my own power. I destroyed a temple and killed 17 innocent people. How could I possibly be the key to saving anyone? Because power without control is chaos, Seraphina replied gently. But power channeled through love, through the unbreakable bond between true mates, becomes something else entirely. It becomes hope. She raised her hand, and the air above her palm shimmered, forming images that moved like living memories. The ancient evil I speak of is called the Void King, a being from the space between realms who feeds on magical energy itself. Centuries ago, he was sealed away by the combined power of all the supernatural races of Valenheart. But the seals are weakening, and when he breaks free, he will devour every spark of magic in this realm until nothing remains but an empty husk. The images showed a figure wreathed in absolute darkness, standing over landscapes that had been drained of all color and life. Where the Void King passed, forests withered to ash, and rivers ran black with corruption. The only force powerful enough to stop him is the Storm Crown, a legendary artifact that can only be wielded by a Stormborn Omega whose power has been stabilized and amplified by her mate bond with a true Alpha. Seraphina's eyes fixed on them with laser intensity. You are that Omega, Lyra, and Cale is that Alpha. Where is this Storm Crown? Cale asked, his tactical mind already working through the implications. Hidden, Seraphina said simply. Protected by trials that will test not just your individual strengths, but the depth of your bond with each other. Many have sought it over the centuries. All have failed because they lacked what you two possess. And what's that? Lyra whispered. Perfect trust. Before anyone could respond to that declaration, a new sound reached their ears. Not the hunting horns of the Silver Dawn, but something far worse. It was a keening wail that seemed to come from the very air itself, a sound that made every supernatural instinct scream warnings of immediate danger. Seraphina was on her feet instantly, her expression transformed from serene wisdom to sharp alarm. Impossible, it's too soon, the seals shouldn't be weakening this quickly. What is that sound? Cale demanded, his hand automatically moving to his weapon. A breach, the Oracle Witch said grimly. One of the Void King's servants has broken through the barriers between realms. It's hunting for the Stormborn energy signature. Her eyes locked on Lyra. It's hunting for you. The keening sound grew louder, and with it came a wrongness in the air that made Lyra's lightning magic recoil instinctively. This wasn't just a dangerous creature. It was something fundamentally opposed to the very concept of life and magic. The sanctuary protections, Lyra said urgently. Will they hold against this thing? Seraphina shook her head. The ancient wards were designed to hide you from earthly threats. A void wraith exists partially outside our reality. It will find you eventually, barriers or no barriers. As if summoned by her words, something dark and terrible began to take shape at the edge of the clearing. It was vaguely humanoid but wrong in every possible way. Its limbs too long, its movements too fluid, and where its face should have been was nothing but a swirling vortex of absolute emptiness. We fight, Kale said simply, his form already beginning to shift as his wolf rose to meet the threat. No, Seraphina said sharply. You run. You're not ready to face the Void King's servants directly. Not yet. She began pulling items from a pouch at her waist, crystals that pulsed with contained power. I'll hold it off as long as I can, but you need to get to the Sunspire Mountains. There's a hidden temple there where you can begin the trials for the Storm Crown. We're not leaving you to face that thing alone, Lyra protested, but even as she spoke, she could feel her power recoiling from the Void Wraith's presence like a candle flame shrinking away from a harsh wind. You are, Seraphina said firmly, because if you die here tonight, then everyone dies. The realm falls, the Void King devours everything, and all the sacrifices made to seal him away become meaningless. She pressed a small, intricately carved compass into Lyra's hands. This will guide you to the temple. Follow it, trust in each other, and remember, the trials ahead will test your bond in ways you cannot imagine. The Void Wraith let out another keening wail, and this time the sound was close enough to make the stone circle's runes flicker and dim. Go, Seraphina commanded, power beginning to crackle around her in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Now, the Chapter 8. Flight to the Mountains. They ran through the night, guided by the mysterious compass that seemed to pull them inexorably toward the distant peaks of the Sunspire Mountains. Behind them, flashes of light and sounds like reality being torn apart marked Seraphina's battle with the Void Wraith, but neither Lyra nor Kale dared to look back. How far to the mountains? Lyra gasped as they crested a hill and paused for a moment to catch their breath. Kale consulted the compass, its needle pointing steadily northeast, despite the fact that they were nowhere near any magnetic source. At this pace, 3 days, maybe 2 if we push hard and don't run into any more hunters. The Oracle said the trials would test our bond, Lyra said, studying his profile in the moonlight. What do you think that means? I think, Kale said carefully, that whatever we face, we'll face it together. That has to be enough. They resumed their journey, moving through terrain that grew increasingly wild and untamed as they left the civilized regions behind. But as the hours passed, Lyra became aware of something troubling. The mate bond that had felt so strong and clear back at the sanctuary was beginning to feel strained. It started small. Kyle would reach for her hand to help her over a difficult patch of ground, and instead of the warm energy exchange they'd grown accustomed to, there would be only ordinary touch. When she tried to channel her lightning while maintaining contact with him, the power felt unstable, harder to control. Something's wrong, she said finally, as they sheltered in a cave during the pre-dawn hours. The bond, it's not working the way it was before. Kyle had noticed it too. She could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way his wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin. Maybe it's the distance from the sanctuary, or maybe it's the influence of whatever that Void Wraith was carrying with it. Or maybe, a new voice said from the cave entrance, it's because you're both lying to each other about what you're really afraid of. They spun toward the sound, weapons ready, but the figure who stepped into the firelight was neither hunter nor monster. It was a young man, perhaps 25, with the pointed ears and otherworldly beauty of the Fae. His clothes were rich but practical, and his eyes held the kind of ancient wisdom that spoke of magic, far older than anything in the human realms. Who are you? Kyle demanded, not lowering his blade. Prince Darian of the Autumn Court, the newcomer said with a slight bow. And before you ask, no, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here because my court has a vested interest in seeing the Void King remain sealed away. His hunger doesn't discriminate between human magic and Fae magic. Lyra studied the Fae Prince with her enhanced senses, trying to read his intentions. Unlike the Void Wraith, his presence felt clean, natural, though there was definitely power there, old and deep and carefully controlled. You said we were lying to each other, she said. About what? Darian settled himself near the fire with the fluid grace characteristic of his people. About your fears regarding this mate bond. You, he looked at Lyra, are terrified that you're not worthy of someone as powerful as the Shadow Alpha, that your broken, dangerous magic makes you a burden rather than a partner. Lyra flinched as if he'd slapped her. And you, Darian turned to Kale, are afraid that your reputation as a ruthless killer means you'll eventually corrupt or destroy the one pure thing you've found in your life. You think she deserves better than someone whose hands are stained with so much blood. Kale's expression went completely blank, the way it did when he was fighting to maintain control. The mate bond responds to emotional honesty, Darian continued gently. When you hide your true feelings from each other, even with the best of intentions, it weakens the connection. The trials ahead will force these fears into the open whether you want them to be or not. Better to face them now, when you have the luxury of choice. Why should we trust anything you say? Kale asked, but his voice lacked its usual edge. Because, Darian said simply, my court's seers have seen what happens if you fail. The Void King doesn't just devour this realm. He uses it as a stepping stone to invade the Fey realms, and from there every other magical dimension that exists. This isn't just about saving Valenheart anymore, it's about saving everything. The fire crackled between them, as the full weight of their responsibility settled over the cave like a heavy blanket. So, Darian said, his tone becoming deliberately lighter, shall we discuss these fears that are undermining your bond, or would you prefer to wait until you're facing down a trial that could kill you both? Lyra looked at Kyle, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his silver eyes. The Fey Prince was right. She could feel the truth of his words in the way the mate bond flickered between them like a candle in an unstable wind. I go first, she said quietly, her violet eyes never leaving Kale's face. Because if we're going to trust each other with our lives, we need to start with our truths. Chapter 9. Hearts Laid Bare. The cave fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fire. Lyra drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she searched for the words to voice fears she'd never spoken aloud. Every person I've ever cared about has been hurt because of what I am, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. My parents lived in constant fear that I'd accidentally electrocute my younger sister. The priestesses at the temple died because I couldn't control my power when they tried to help me. Even the hunters who are chasing us, they're not entirely wrong when they call me dangerous. Kyle started to speak, but she shook her head, needing to get it all out before her courage failed. When I look at you, I see someone who's built something incredible. You have a pack that respects you, territory that you fought to protect, a reputation that makes other alphas think twice before challenging you. You're strong and controlled and everything I've never been able to be. Her violet eyes finally met his. And I'm terrified that being bonded to me will destroy all of that, that my chaos will corrupt your order, and everyone you care about will suffer for it. The words hung in the air between them like a physical weight. Prince Darian watched with ancient eyes, but he remained silent, letting the truth settle into the space the way morning dew settles on grass. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his silver gaze studying her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. You want to know what I see when I look at you? He asked. I see someone who has more power in her little finger than most alphas have in their entire bodies, and who chooses mercy over vengeance every single time. You could have killed those hunters back at the cabin, but you held back. You worry about accidentally hurting people who are actively trying to murder you. He leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. My pack respects me because they fear me, Lyra. They follow my orders because they know the consequences of disobedience, but they don't love me. How could they when I've done things? He stopped, his jaw clenching as old memories surfaced. What things? She asked softly. 3 years ago, a rival pack tried to take our territory. Their alpha challenged me to single combat, but when I killed him, his mate tried to avenge him. She was pregnant, Lyra, 6 months pregnant, and she came at me with a silver blade because grief had driven her beyond reason. His voice became barely audible. I could have disarmed her, could have knocked her unconscious, could have done a dozen things that didn't involve killing her, but I was still in battle fury, and I reacted with lethal force. The confession hung between them like a poisonous cloud. Lyra felt her breath catch, not with horror, but with understanding of the guilt he'd been carrying. I killed a pregnant woman, Kyle continued, and her unborn child. In that moment, I became exactly the monster everyone already thought I was. Since then, every decision I've made has been calculated to prevent that kind of loss of control from happening again. I've built walls around myself so high that no one can get close enough to trigger that level of rage again. He looked up at her, and she saw raw pain in his silver eyes. Until you. You make me feel things I thought I'd buried so deep they'd never surface again, and I'm terrified that if I let myself care about you the way my wolf is demanding, I'll lose control again. Only this time, it might be you who pays the price. Prince Darian nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his mind. Fear of corruption from both directions. She fears her chaos will destroy his order. He fears his violence will destroy her purity. Classic mate-bond complications. "Is there a solution?" Lyra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "The same solution that's worked for millennia," Darian said simply. "Accept each other completely, flaws and all." "The mate bond doesn't require perfection. It requires truth and acceptance." Kyle shook his head. "You make it sound simple." "Simple, yes. Easy, no." The Fey Prince smiled sadly. "The trials ahead will force you to rely on each other in ways that will either strengthen your bond beyond breaking or shatter it completely. But the choice of which outcome occurs is still yours to make." As if summoned by his words, the compass Seraphina had given them began to pulse with a soft, rhythmic light. Dawn was breaking outside the cave, and the needle was pointing steadily toward the mountain peaks that rose in the distance like ancient sentinels. "We should move," Lyra said, getting to her feet. "Whatever's waiting for us at that temple, we need to face it." But as she turned toward the cave entrance, Kyle caught her hand. The moment their skin made contact, that warm energy flowed between them again, stronger than it had been since leaving the sanctuary. "I need you to know," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "that I would rather face the end of the world with you than live safely without you. Whatever happens in these trials, whatever we discover about ourselves or each other, that won't change." Lyra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came with relief rather than sorrow. "I feel the same way, about all of it." When they kissed, it was soft and tentative, but the electrical current that passed between them was anything but gentle. Lightning danced around them in patterns that were beautiful rather than destructive, while the very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities. Prince Darian cleared his throat delicately. "While I hate to interrupt what is clearly a pivotal romantic moment, we do have void creatures hunting for you, and the protective wards on this cave won't hold indefinitely." They broke apart, both breathless, but the mate bond between them now hummed with strength and certainty. "Ready?" Kyle asked, offering her his hand. "Ready," Lyra replied, taking it without hesitation. Together they stepped out into the dawn light, heading toward whatever trials awaited them in the ancient temple of the Sunspire Mountains. Dumar Chapter 10, The Temple of Trials. The temple, when they finally reached it, after 2 days of hard travel through increasingly treacherous mountain paths, was not what any of them had expected. Instead of the grand stone edifice Lyra had envisioned, they found a simple circle of standing stones similar to the sanctuary, but these stones were carved from some kind of crystal that seemed to contain trapped lightning. The air around the temple hummed with barely contained energy, and every supernatural sense they possessed warned of immense power held in careful balance. "It's beautiful," Lyra breathed, approaching the nearest crystal monolith. The trapped lightning within seemed to pulse in response to her presence, recognizing something familiar in her storm-born nature. "And dangerous," Prince Darian added, though his tone held more appreciation than concern. "The magic here is older than the Fey courts, older than the first werewolf packs. This place was built by the ancients themselves, before they departed for realms beyond our reach." Kyle moved to stand beside Lyra, and when he placed his hand on her shoulder, the crystals flared brighter, responding to their combined presence. "How do we begin the trials?" "You already have," a new voice said from within the stone circle. "The moment you stepped onto sacred ground with hearts finally open to each other, the first trial began." The voice belonged to a figure that materialized from what had seemed like empty air, tall and ethereal, with features that shifted between human and something far more ancient. When it spoke, the very stones seemed to listen. "I am the guardian of the trials," it continued. "I have waited centuries for a bonded pair strong enough to seek the storm crown. Many have tried. All have failed. Will you succeed where they could not?" "What do the trials involve?" Lyra asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. "3 challenges," the guardian replied. "The trial of trust, where you must place your lives entirely in each other's hands. The trial of sacrifice, where you must choose between personal desire and the greater good. And the trial of unity, where your individual powers must become one force or be destroyed in the attempt." The crystal stones began to pulse in a synchronized rhythm, and the air within the circle started to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Many couples have love, the Guardian continued. Many have power. Few have the perfect trust and willingness to sacrifice that true mate bonds require. Are you prepared to discover which category you belong to? Kyle and Lyra exchanged a look that held entire conversations. After everything they'd shared, all the fears and truths laid bare, there was really only one answer they could give. "We're ready," they said in unison. The Guardian smiled, and in that expression was both blessing and warning. Then let the first trial begin. The world around them dissolved into swirling mist, and when it cleared, they were standing in what appeared to be a vast underground cavern. The floor was a narrow stone bridge, spanning a chasm so deep that no bottom was visible, and the bridge itself was crumbling, with gaps that would require precise jumps to navigate. But the real challenge became apparent when Lyra tried to move forward and discovered she couldn't see the bridge at all. To her eyes, there was nothing but empty air, where Kyle could clearly see solid stone. "I can see the path," Kyle said, understanding immediately. "But you can't." "And I can sense where the safe spots are," Lyra replied, closing her eyes and extending her electrical awareness. "But I can't see the physical obstacles." The Guardian's voice echoed through the cavern. "The trial of trust. One of you must guide, one must follow, and both must have absolute faith in the other. Choose your roles wisely. A single misstep means death for both." Prince Darian, who had materialized at the edge of the cavern but could clearly go no further, called out to them. "Remember, the bond between you is stronger than any individual ability. Trust in that above all else." Kyle extended his hand to Lyra, and when she took it, the familiar warm energy flowed between them. But this time, it felt different, more intense, more focused, as if the trial itself was amplifying their connection. "I trust you," Lyra said simply. "And I trust you," Kyle replied. Together they stepped onto the invisible bridge, heading into the unknown with nothing but their faith in each other to guide them.